It was a warm night in the middle of the Pacific Ocean when General Quarters was sounded. GQ meant that all Navy personnel on the ship were to man their battle stations. I am sure most of the landing craft crews had not slept very much before GQ was sounded. We knew that it would be the first time we would be hitting the beach and unloading tanks under enemy fire. All landing craft crews had been outfitted with battle clothing and equipment before we left Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. We had steel helmets and carbine rifles. We also had life jackets that we always wore on small boats. The mechanized landing craft were manned by 4 Navy sailors. Soldiers or Marines were always on the beach before we landed tanks, and we could not fire toward the beach because we might hit our own soldiers who landed first to protect the tanks. We would fire the machine gun only if we were being strafed by enemy aircraft. After General Quarters had sounded on our ship, and we had driven all the landing craft out of our mothership, it was approximately 5 a.m. when we joined with other landing craft boats from other ships nearby. Other landing craft were carrying soldiers attached to the 7th Infantry. These soldiers would land first to protect the tanks the LCMs were carrying. We circled until we received the signal to form our boats into a V formation. There were several waves of landing craft loaded with soldiers that would start for the beach before the LCMs. We would receive a signal to head for the beach with the tanks after the beach had been secured and the Japanese had been driven a safe distance from the beach. When we received the signal to land the tanks, all of the LCMs headed for the beach in a V formation. There were about 15 LCMs that formed one wave that would hit the beach loaded with tanks. We got a very unpleasant surprise when we were about 250 yards from the beach. A small American reconnaissance plane flew too low in front of our wave of boats and was struck by a shell that had been fired from one of the warships offshore. The plane exploded into many small pieces, and we knew the pilot could not possibly have survived. Even if we thought the pilot could be rescued, we could not have broken ranks in the landing wave because any boat breaking ranks would have interrupted the timing of all boats in the wave. All boats had to slow down to miss the debris of the fallen plane. We had a difficult time getting over the coral when we landed on the beach because we were loaded with a heavy tank and we had only one engine. We would wait for a big wave and then we would give the boat all the power we could manage with one engine. We hit the beach only a few minutes after the other boats had landed and unloaded their tanks. We were not frightened by the Japanese, but we were really frightened by unexploded shells lying on the beach. The shells were so huge, we surmised that they had been fired by one of the battleships that were several miles offshore. We landed at this difficult point on the beach because the officers that planned the landing were sure the Japanese would not suspect that the Americans would attempt to bring landing craft boats over the coral. Much to everyone's surprise, the infantry landing on the island to protect the tanks met significantly more resistance than the Army anticipated. The Army had been informed that there were very few Japanese troops on the small island. Kwajalein Island was the largest island in the Marshall Islands group. It was the island that we had landed on the day before, and Kwajalein had been secured. We had inflicted a lot of damage on Kwajalein and killed thousands of Japanese soldiers. We had lost several landing craft boats in taking the island of Kwajalein. There were at least 5,000 Japanese soldiers on Kwajalein. Most of them had been killed because they refused to surrender. The last remaining troops had to be flushed out of foxholes and caves with flamethrowers. There were so many dead Japanese it was difficult to dispose of the bodies. The Army decided to dig deep trenches with Caterpillar tractors, shove the bodies into the trenches, and then cover them with sand. Both the Army and Navy assumed that most of the Japanese soldiers on Kwajalein had been killed. However, many of the Japanese on Kwajalein had escaped to a nearby island by crossing over to another island, codenamed Burton Island, by walking on the coral during a very low tide. Officers in charge of the invasion did not believe they would meet any resistance on Burton Island, so they did not order tanks to support ground troops. Unbeknownst to the officers in charge, approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers had escaped from Kwajalein to Burton. When the ground troops met a lot of resistance, the commanders in charge ordered the tanks to be brought ashore to support the ground troops. Because our boat had experienced a mechanical problem, we were not ordered to take our tank ashore immediately. The Japanese had established a machine gun foothold behind a large cement dock, and they were killing a lot of American troops. A tank commander radioed that they needed all tanks because of the American casualties. We were instructed to land our tank on the beach where the other boats had landed theirs. By the time we got headed for the beach, the other boats had already backed off the beach. We began to draw very heavy machine gun fire even before we reached the beach. We delivered the tank, but because we had only one engine, our boat got stuck on the beach. We were a sitting duck for the Japanese machine gun. The Japanese were directing all their fire toward the cockpit on our boat. The .50 caliber bullets were going through the quarter-inch steel of the landing craft like it was paper. One of our deckhands was hit in the chest by a bullet and was killed the minute we hit the beach. We were stunned by the size of the hole in his chest. We knew there was no way he could survive such a horrible wound. We decided that it would be much safer if we lay down on one side of the boat near the bow. The Japanese were firing at the stern. There would be a lot of machine gun fire, and then it would be silent for a short period of time. We later learned that every time the soldiers who had landed would kill the Japanese soldier manning the machine gun, the Japanese would replace him with another gunner. After about 30 minutes, which seemed like hours, the machine gun was silenced for good. However, we did not stand up. We continued to lay on the deck near the bow of the boat. I think we were just frightened to move. We knew our boat had been shot up so badly that we would never get it off the beach. A few minutes after the machine gun fire ceased for the final time, a chaplain boarded our boat from an Army duck, a vehicle that can go on land or water. We never did learn how the chaplain knew we had a casualty aboard our boat. The chaplain, or someone else on a surveillance boat, must have been watching the attack through binoculars. The chaplain knew that one of our crew had been killed. He said, "We will have to bury your buddy here. He will be taken care of by the burial team." The remaining 3 crew members looked at each other and we said in unison, "We don't want to leave him here alone. We want him to go with us." The chaplain said, "Okay, he can go with us, but we can't take him back to your ship. We have to take him to the island where they are processing casualties." The young man killed was a deckhand, Charles Sappington, from Miami, Oklahoma. Many people do not believe in extrasensory perception. I do, and Charlie Sappington evidently had it. When we received our orders to take our tank to the beach, and we were about 200 yards off the beach, he said to the other crew members, "One of us is not coming back. We are going to come under heavy fire. Why don't you let me drive the boat and the rest of you can take cover?" The coxswain would not agree. The coxswain said, "I am the skipper, and I will take this boat to the beach." We were all very sad because of what Charlie had said. The chaplain took us back to our ship. The ship's crew had evidently been advised that one of the landing craft crew had been killed because everyone was quiet. The crew were afraid to say anything because they might say the wrong thing. The other landing craft crews and the tanks and their crews did not return until the following day. The other crews knew that our boat had been shot up, and they knew someone was killed because they were watching from their boats when we were rescued by the chaplain. It took about 3 days for it to sink in that Charlie had been killed and was not coming back. The other crew members of our boat and I thought it would have been much better if we had returned to Pearl Harbor so we would not have to be reminded every day of the invasion that caused the death of our buddy. We were left on Kwajalein, along with many other boat crews, to man the boat pool that would be formed there.